It still pisses me off how long I let them take credit for my work. Not just once or twice, but year after year for over a decade. Quick note, before listening, share which city or country you're watching from. My name's Nathan. I'm 44 years old. I live in Naperville, just outside Chicago. For 12 years, I was the Senior Director of Operations and Strategy at a mid-sized logistics analytics firm downtown. Not a sexy role, not one people outside the building knew, but I was the reason we stayed profitable. I fixed the broken models. I rerouted vendor pipelines. I rebuilt half our forecasting system from scratch when the platform vendor tanked. I was the guy who'd stay late, get it done, keep it quiet. Douglas Hartman, our CEO, used to call me his secret weapon. The guy loved buzzwords, said once he couldn't function without me, promised I'd be his COO as soon as he cleaned house at the executive level, said that at least a dozen times. And like a moron, I believed him. The signs were always there. He once brought his niece into a product meeting and called her a millennial innovation lens. She asked if our dashboard had synergy with TikTok. That should have been a red flag the size of Michigan. But I kept telling myself, competence still matters. Loyalty matters. Someone has to actually run the company. What I didn't get back then was that Douglas didn't value loyalty. He valued control. Yes, image. He liked having his people around, people who looked the part, people with the right last names. I never made noise. I wasn't flashy. I didn't golf or schmooze or join those fake post-work happy hours. But I ran the numbers, ran the teams, and ran the ship when it was sinking. Everyone underestimated me because I wasn't the loudest guy in the room. But they forgot something. I was the only one who understood how everything fit together. And the truth? My biggest mistake wasn't working too hard or being too loyal. My biggest mistake was assuming a private promise meant a damn thing once nepotism walked through the door. I didn't want the spotlight. I never cared about titles or applause. But I did care about one thing: accountability. And when that line got crossed, I didn't yell. The first time I met Trevor Hartman, he showed up 20 minutes late to the Monday strategy sync, wearing Yeezys and sipping a green juice. Sat down across from me, grinned, and said, "Let's disrupt something today." I thought he was joking. He wasn't. Trevor was 26, fresh out of some overpriced MBA program, and had just been hired under a brand new title Douglas made up: Innovation Lead. No defined responsibilities. No KPIs. Just a vague job description about strategic transformation and interdepartmental synergy. Translation: he was there to play executive dress-up while the rest of us kept the lights on. Douglas called me into his office later that day, sat back in his leather chair, tapped the desk with that smug little smile, and said, "I want you to mentor Trevor, give him real exposure, help him understand how things work here." When I didn't respond, he leaned in. "It's also a chance for you, Nathan. You've always been good at quietly fixing things. Let's turn that into leadership." I should have walked out right then. Instead, I ended up spending the next 6 months babysitting a grown man who thought Excel was antiquated and that numbers should tell a story, not report the past. He treated our forecasting models like a game, deleted whole rows, renamed variables to things like rocket fuel and mojo factor. I had to rebuild 2 models from scratch before I finally told him to stop touching anything without clearing it with me first. I wasn't his mentor, I was his handler. And while I was rewriting his work, sitting in the double the meetings and explaining the basics of carrier rate structures for the 100th time, Trevor was strutting around the office like he was some kind of visionary. He'd throw out nonsense in meetings. "Let's Uberize our logistics platform." Then sit back with that smug, satisfied look, while everyone nodded like he'd said something genius. Nobody pushed back, not once. The other execs saw what was happening. You could see it in their faces: tight smiles, forced nods, eyes flicking my way during meetings. But nobody said a word. Nobody was going to risk their bonus package by challenging Douglas's golden boy. The family angle made Trevor untouchable. The quarterly all-hands was held in the big glass conference room, overlooking the river, the one Douglas only used when he wanted to feel important. Rows of folding chairs, catered breakfast nobody touched, the low hum of forced small talk. I took my usual seat near the aisle, notebook on my lap, pen ready. Same routine as always. Douglas walked in late, smiling like he'd already won something. Trevor followed right behind him, chest out, suit too tight, tie slightly crooked like he didn't know how to finish the job. That should have been my second warning. Douglas clapped his hands once. All right, everyone, let's get started. Today's about a new strategic direction. I didn't look up at first. I figured this was another one of his speeches. Big words, recycled slides, me explaining the fallout later. But then he started talking about elevating fresh perspectives and aligning leadership with future growth. And my stomach tightened. I felt it before I understood it. Then he said Trevor's name. He announced it like it was a gift to all of us. Promoted Trevor to Executive Director of Strategy and Innovation, the role I'd been promised in private meetings, late nights, quiet assurances. The room went dead silent for half a second. That half second stretched forever. Then came the applause. Not real applause, polite, awkward. People clapping because they didn't know what else to do. I didn't move. My hand stayed on my notebook. My face felt hot, like every pair of eyes was on me. But nobody actually looked. I glanced around. Executives stared at the floor. One guy adjusted his glasses 3 times. Another checked his phone like he'd just gotten an urgent text. Nobody met my eyes, not one of them. Douglas kept talking, smiling wide, but he never once looked at me. Not even by accident. That's when it clicked. He knew exactly what he was doing. This wasn't a mistake or an oversight. This was a decision. A public one. Trevor stood up, waved like he was accepting an award, said something about honored to step into this opportunity. His voice cracked halfway through. He had no idea what he'd just walked into. I felt embarrassed, but not the messy kind. It was cold, clean, like something snapping into place. I closed my notebook, capped my pen, and sat still until the meeting ended. No outburst, no scene. I even nodded once when Douglas looked my way at the very end, like we were still on the same team. As soon as the room started clearing, I stood up and walked straight back to my office. My hands didn't shake. I shut the door, sat down, and opened my laptop. I typed my resignation letter in 10 minutes. Short. Professional. No accusations, no emotion. Effective immediately. I printed it, folded it once, and walked back down the hall. Douglas was laughing with Trevor outside his office. I waited until they finished, handed Douglas the letter. He looked confused. "What's this?" "My resignation," I said. "Effective today." Trevor's smile vanished. Douglas blinked like he'd misheard me. "Nathan, let's talk about this." "There's nothing to talk about," I said, calm, flat. "You made your choice." I turned and walked away before he could respond. By the time I reached the elevator, word was already spreading. Doors closed. I rode down alone. When the doors opened in the lobby, I stepped out, badge still clipped to my belt, and kept walking straight through the front doors without slowing down. I stepped out onto Wacker Drive and just stood there for a second. No plan, no calls to make, no meetings to prep for. I'd walked out of that building hundreds of times before, always checking my phone, always thinking 2 steps ahead. That day, for the first time, I had nothing to carry, no responsibilities, no fire waiting for me back inside. The cold hit me first, then the quiet, real quiet, like the kind that makes your head ring when you've been living in noise too long. I took a deep breath and just stood there, watching the traffic move like I'd never noticed it before. 15 minutes later, I got the email. "Please return for exit processing with HR at your earliest convenience." Corporate translation. Come clean out your desk and sign some paperwork. So I went back the next morning. Same building, same elevator, but it already felt different. People glanced at me like I was a ghost. Some nodded, most looked away. I didn't care. I walked straight to my old floor and headed for my office. Except it wasn't mine anymore. Trevor was already moved in. His laptop was open, papers scattered everywhere. One of my old spreadsheets minimized on the screen. He leaned back in my old chair like he'd earned it. "Hey Nathan," he said, all cheerful like nothing had happened. "Didn't expect to see you back so soon." "I'm here for HR," I said, just grabbing my things. He stood up, tried to act respectful, but the arrogance leaked through every movement. "We're actually making some changes to the budgeting structure, thinking quarterly buckets instead of monthly constraints. Faster innovation cycle." I looked at him for a long second. "You're going to run into compliance issues by the second quarter," he blinked. "What do you mean?" "Quarterly buckets violate our vendor contracts, and cash flow will tank without monthly controls. It's in the financial systems report. Not the version you skimmed, the real one." He shrugged. "We'll adapt. We're building for agility now." Of course you are, I thought. I didn't argue. I just reached for my old binder on the shelf. Tucked inside was one document, an internal governance memo I'd written 6 months back. Risk models, control gaps, early flags I'd raised, and Douglas had ignored. Nothing sabotage-worthy, just the truth, clean and clear. I slid it onto Trevor's desk without a word. "What's this?" he asked. "Insurance," I said. "You won't read it, but someone will when this all starts falling apart." He laughed like I was joking. "Appreciate the vote of confidence." I didn't smile. "You should." I grabbed my box, walked down the hallway, and signed the HR forms without fanfare. They asked if I wanted an exit interview. I said no. Nobody stopped me on the way out. Nobody thanked me. 3 years before any of this blew up, we were closing a private equity deal with a firm out of Boston. Not huge, but enough to make Douglas sweat. He kept saying things like, "We're entering the big leagues," and "This is how we scale for real." What he meant was more money, more meetings, more attention, and more paperwork he didn't want to read. The deal had a dozen moving parts: capital injection, board structure, preferred shares, executive comp, stuff Douglas barely pretended to understand. I was in every negotiation call, every late-night draft review, running point with the legal team, while Douglas played golf with the managing partner. And buried in all that mess, I added a clause. It wasn't sneaky. It wasn't illegal. It was right there in Section 6.3, Governance Failsafe Provision, 2 paragraphs written in plain English, right after the board voting terms. The clause gave our investors limited power to intervene if the executive team made decisions that posed material risk due to demonstrable negligence or unqualified appointments. It wasn't dramatic. No gotcha language. Just a quiet safety valve that required documentation, pattern of failure, and formal notice. I'd pitched it as good governance, a backstop in case leadership went sideways. Douglas skimmed it. I watched him do it. He flipped through the printed draft with his Mont Blanc pen in hand, barely pausing. "Looks fine," he muttered. Then he signed. He didn't ask a single question. At the time, I filed it away in the back of my mind. I wasn't planning anything, but I'd seen too many execs screw up and drag everyone down with them. I wasn't going to let that happen without an off-ramp. Fast forward to Trevor. His appointment hit every trigger the clause outlined. No experience, no oversight, no vetting. Just a family name and a title. Then came the compliance gaps. Monthly financials stopped aligning with the forecast. Vendor payment cycles broke. Internal controls went soft. People noticed. They just didn't connect the dots. I did, because that clause, it wasn't about punishing anyone. It was about protecting the company when leadership stopped doing their job. And now, it was active. I kept copies of everything: board packets, audit trails, internal reports. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I knew what was coming. I could feel it building every time Trevor sent another email filled with buzzwords and bad math. Every time Douglas shrugged off a red flag with, "It's all part of the transition." Every time compliance called and nobody picked up. They didn't fall all at once. They cracked piece by piece. And that clause? It wasn't a trap. It was a mirror. And when the day came, it reflected exactly what they'd done to themselves. The downfall wasn't sudden. It wasn't shocking. It was slow, sloppy, and documented in black and white. And the best part? They couldn't say they weren't warned. The warning was written into the deal they had signed. The paper trail led right back to their own signatures. Trevor's failure wasn't some freak accident. It was built into the system the second Douglas put family above competence. The second He ignored the fine print. People always act surprised when things fall apart. But collapse doesn't come out of nowhere. It follows a pattern. And if you know what to look for, you can see it coming a mile away. All I did was write it down. The first real sign came 2 weeks after I left. I got a call from a former analyst, someone I'd mentored early on. She sounded tense, careful with her words. "You didn't hear this from me," she said, "but they just cut the compliance vendor." I didn't respond at first. I knew exactly what that meant. Trevor probably saw the monthly invoice and decided it was a waste of money. He never understood what compliance actually did. To him, it was just paperwork. In reality, it was the duct tape holding the entire financial structure together. Vendor vetting, contract audits, regulatory updates, all of it. Cutting them was like ripping the battery out of a smoke detector because it beeped too much. From there, it was like watching a slow-motion car crash you couldn't look away from. Forecasts got bolder, more disconnected from reality. Trevor started promising double-digit growth on calls without any operational plan to back it up. He pitched new tech integrations that didn't exist. He told investors we were weeks away from automation tools that weren't even scoped yet. I didn't have to dig for the evidence. It started showing up in my inbox without me asking. Former colleagues, quiet connections, even one of the junior board advisors forwarded me internal updates. "Thought you'd want to see this," they'd write. So I built a folder, labeled everything: investor slide decks, shipment volume reports, internal morale surveys. The data was all there: missed targets, bottleneck delays, invoice freezes. One file showed vendor churn up by 40%. Another showed 3 large carriers putting shipments on hold due to delayed payments. And still, Trevor smiled through every quarterly call like nothing was wrong. I wasn't some bitter ex-employee trying to burn the place down. That's not how I operate. Professional due diligence. Because when the clause I'd written kicked in, there couldn't be any ambiguity. The failsafe required proof, clear evidence of negligence, repeated missteps, material risk. So that's exactly what I collected. HR reports started leaking into my hands next. Turnover had tripled. Senior managers were quitting quietly. The morale survey showed confidence in leadership had cratered. Trevor responded by hosting a culture pizza day and filming it for LinkedIn. I watched that video 5 times. The fake smiles, the forced laughter, the empty chairs in the background. He had no idea how deep the cracks were. Douglas, for his part, stayed behind the curtain. Let Trevor absorb the hits while he played the role of high-level strategist. I recognized the move. Distance yourself just enough to claim innocence when it all explodes. Problem was, I had his fingerprints on too many of the decisions. He'd signed off on budget cuts, the fake projections, the appointments. The investors noticed eventually. You could see it in the shift of language. Less growth potential, more operational questions. One investor memo flat out asked why compliance costs had dropped 30% in a quarter. That's when I knew we'd crossed the line. The clause didn't activate on screw-ups. It triggered when screw-ups became patterns. And that's exactly what was happening. Negligent leadership, false projections, abandoned controls, financial misrepresentation. Every box was checked, every safeguard ignored. I didn't celebrate. I didn't call anyone. I just kept building the file. Because when the call came, and I knew it would, I wanted to walk into that meeting with everything they'd need. Trevor hadn't failed in secret. He failed in public. Loud, proud, and documented in 4 different systems. Douglas hadn't stopped him because deep down, he didn't think it mattered. They forgot that systems have limits, and when you blow past every one of them, the system pushes back. The call finally came on a Tuesday morning. Unknown number, Boston area code. "Is this Nathan?" a man asked. "Yes. This is Richard Lowell, managing partner at Graybridge Capital. We need to talk." We met 2 days later in a quiet conference room at a downtown hotel. No small talk, no pleasantries. Richard didn't smile once. He slid a legal pad across the table and said, "Start from the beginning." So I did. I walked him through the documents one by one. Compliance termination, forecast deviations, vendor freezes, investor misstatements. I didn't editorialize. I didn't speculate. I just showed him the timeline. He stopped me halfway through and asked, "Why are you doing this?" "Because you paid for governance," I said, "and you're not getting it." That was enough. He flipped to the back of the binder and tapped the page with his pen. "Section 6.3, he said. "You wrote this?" "Yes." "You realize this triggers an emergency board action?" "I do." He nodded once. "Then we're invoking it." The board meeting was scheduled for 48 hours later. Emergency session, mandatory attendance. I wasn't invited as a participant, just an observer. That was fine by me. I didn't need a vote. I just needed a chair. The room was tense the second I walked in. Douglas was already there, pacing near the window, phone pressed to his ear. Trevor sat at the table, tapping on his laptop, trying to look busy. He froze when he saw me. Douglas turned around, his face drained of color. "What is he doing here?" he asked. Richard answered before I could. "He's here because he understands the contracts you signed." The meeting started hard and fast. No warm-up, no CEO monologue. Richard laid out the findings like a prosecutor, slide after slide of discrepancies, breaches, and contradictions. The projections Trevor had presented didn't match internal data. The compliance lapse violated 3 investor covenants. The vendor freezes were tied directly to delayed payments. Leadership denied existed. Trevor tried to interrupt. "That's not the full context." Richard cut him off. "You'll speak when asked." Douglas finally jumped in. "This is an overreaction, transitional growing pains." A board member leaned forward. "You certified these numbers." Douglas hesitated. "Based on information provided." "That information was false," another member said. "And you signed off anyway." The room went quiet. Real quiet. Trevor's confidence cracked fast. He started flipping through his notes, mumbling about innovation cycles and market shifts. Nobody listened. One board member asked him to explain why compliance costs dropped 30% overnight. He couldn't. Another asked why investors were told automation tools were live when procurement emails showed nothing approved. He stared at the table. Douglas tried one last move. "We can fix this internally." Richard shook his head. "You've had months. The clause exists for a reason." Then he said the words that ended it. "Effective immediately, leadership is suspended pending formal review." Security stepped in from the side of the room. Calm, professional, no shouting. Douglas stood up slowly, like his legs didn't quite work anymore. "This is insane," he said. "I built this company." "No," a board member replied. "You branded it." Trevor looked at me then. Really looked. His mouth opened like he wanted to say something. He didn't. They were escorted out together. No speeches, no drama. Just 2 men walking past a room full of people who wouldn't meet their eyes. The board didn't know what to do next. You could feel it. Papers shuffled, whispered conversations, panic hiding behind legal language. Richard turned to me. "We need someone steady, someone who understands the systems. The board wants to offer you the executive role, interim at least." I didn't answer right away. I stood up, gathered my binder, and closed it. "No," I said, "I'm not coming back." The room went still again. "You're the best option," someone said. "I was," I replied, "before you showed me exactly how replaceable integrity is to you." I walked to the door, paused with my hand on the handle, and turned back once. "This didn't happen because of one bad hire," I said. "It happened because nobody here stopped it when it mattered." Then I opened the door and walked out while they were still figuring out who was going to clean up the mess I'd finally stopped fixing. I stepped into the elevator, hit the lobby button, and felt nothing but clarity. They'd finally offered me the role they dangled for years, only now it came from fear, not respect. And I didn't need their fear. I didn't need their approval. I sure as hell didn't need their title. What I needed was out. For good. 2 months later, I launched my own firm. Small team, tight focus, governance risk, leadership accountability, investor transparency. The kind of work I used to do in the shadows, now done on my terms, with clients who actually listened. No fluff, no politics, no suits trying to pass off chaos as strategy. The irony? Half our clients came from firms that made the same mistakes Douglas did, hiring charisma over competence, ignoring controls until the money started bleeding. I didn't sell fear, I sold structure, and people paid because they'd already seen what happens when you don't have it. The company survived, technically. Graybridge propped it up with new leadership, emergency funding, and a full compliance rebuild. But it was never the same. They lost half their top talent in 6 months. 2 major contracts didn't renew. A year later, their valuation was down 40%. Douglas disappeared quietly. No farewell post. No new ventures. Last I heard, he was consulting out of Florida for startups that didn't know his history. Trevor flailed for a while, tried to rebrand as an innovation coach on LinkedIn, posted long threads about lessons learned without ever naming what he actually did. Eventually, the engagement dried up, and so did the job offers. I think he's selling SaaS tools now. Maybe, doesn't matter. People think power is loud, flashy, the guy at the front of the room giving the speech. But real authority? It's what happens when you don't show up, and everything falls apart without you. Silence isn't weakness. Silence is leverage. When you've built something so well, your absence is louder than anything you could say. I didn't destroy that company. I didn't sabotage it. I didn't leak anything or burn anything down. All I did was stop holding it together.